Carrie's speaking for Rob, so have at it.
So I'm just going to read directly what he wrote to me here. He's not able to be here today, but he says, "My name is Rob, and while I'm not here today, I thought I would tell the story that has led me to working alongside Canadian injured workers and calling them my comrades, even as I am being presently lucky enough to be a non-injured worker. Early in my working life, graduating from university into a recession, I worked in a series of low-paying, precarious jobs as a typesetter. That's a document designer connected who usually works in print shops, involving many hours leaning over a computer. At one job, the chair's back support became loose and wasn't fixable, and was no longer comfortable to sit in. I tried to convince the employer to fix or repair the chair, and they would insist that I simply hadn't adjusted the chair properly. As days went on, working in a high-pressure workstation in a chair without back support, my back began to stiffen. I asked again for a new chair, and they refused. I suggested on Friday that if they didn't have a new chair, I'd probably be in too much pain to work on Monday, and they dismissed this as some much complaining. After work, I took medicine for sore back muscles and went home to sleep. In a few hours, when I woke, I could no longer turn my neck or torso or lift myself out of bed. Everything was locked up. After missing a week of work and going to the chiropractors, my muscles finally stopped spasming, and I could return to work where my employer had a new chair waiting. We had a meeting where he offered a small raise if I would not file a WCB claim. Reluctantly, I accepted this, as the ununionized shop, in a recession to boot, offered little protection against the employer's requests that pitted their interests against those of their workers. While this was a short-term injury at which I recovered, I never forgot the sense of real panic while I lay in bed at 27, unable to use the body which was my only source of income, unsure of when I'd get better. Thankfully, although I've been having recurring injuries since then, that time was short and I could continue working. But my experience of powerlessness, both before my injury and my employer, had prompted my curiosity about other workers with grievances. I would learn that my experience of being discouraged by my employer from going to the WCB was one instance of what are called employer experience ratings. A WCB policy, which on paper is supposed to make workplaces safer, by giving employers lower pay and rates for having fewer accidents at their workplaces. But instead, it leads to claim suppression. And employer experience ratings were one consequence of employer-friendly, worker-hostile, right-wing think tanks having the ears of provincial governments, who had many sweeping changes to our economy and legal systems through the 1990s. WCB was among many institutions that were changed to shift the balance of benefits of our economy from workers to employers. I call these changes anti-worker with good reason. As the publicly available policy papers of this time demonstrate, all of these changes reflect a dominant philosophy of the time, that workers were likely to be malingers, whiners, and outright frauds. The primary focus of the WCB in such a situation is not rehabilitation, but to keep claims under control. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, page 9. I wonder about the consequences of such policies for long-term injured workers at WCB. At the time of my injury, I lived in a small city where there was little visible traditions in social activism or union organizing, and especially with a recession, little recourse to find others with your experience. This gave rise, in the town where I lived, to me becoming aware that problems existed at the WCB by first seeing a lone picketer in front of the WCB, by someone who was denied their claim. The lone picketer in my town was a lot like me, someone who had their own experience to go on, only had their own experience to go on, and few people to connect with. Someone who knew the injustices of their own denied claim, but was not intimately aware of the systemic injustice in the claims processes of the WCB. Someone who knew their claim history was a personal narrative, but could not articulate it as a campaign or list of demands for systemic change. Someone who could protest, but who on their own would have difficulties being believed. Especially as I've grown older and more attentive to these experiences, and the way the deck is stacked against the common worker, and the institutions we have created to argue in our own interests have come under attack by employer-friendly governments over the past decades, I have come to think of grassroots workers' campaigns as priceless entities. It is immensely promising to see the rise of Canadian injured workers and an autonomous social movement that takes the issue of workplace injury and compensation into their own hands. To identify key systemic issues with WCB and articulate them as a campaign to overhaul WCB, not just the injustice of one worker's case, but the common denominators of all our cases, is also a crucial step. Only together we can leverage our power as workers and as citizens who can interrupt businesses as usual. This is why it is so crucial that we build a provincial network of presently injured and presently non-injured workers, and we reach out to allies in both groups. All workers at work today, after all, are merely temporarily able-bodied, all potentially injurable. As a presently uninjured worker, I appeal to attendees to the barbecue today for your concerted support for Canadian injured workers, to make it a cause that you support with your donated time, labor, money, and spirit. Unless we overhaul the WCB into a truly worker-centered institution, the WCB treatment that your coworker receives today will be the treatment that you or I receive tomorrow. And that's his letter.
Thank you, Terry.